Chapter 1 is how to use your radio, and I'm actually serious. I think we can really skip through some of this stuff. Please stop me if you want to go back to something, but I'm going to move through things a little bit just for the sake of time tonight. In the book, to tag on to what Larry was saying, the highlighted or the bold type with the little code next to it, those are the right answers. Those are literally the answers to the test. Anything in bold is important because it's on the test. We went through different radio form factors, handheld, mobile, base station, modes of transmission. These rubber antennas, they're called rubber ducks. I just skipped right past that, but we know what a microphone is, we know what a transmitter is. It is actually important to understand that this is a transceiver. It's combining two separate functions into one radio. Now, in the old days, I actually could have brought them. I've got a separate transmitter and receiver. Each one weighs about 60, 70 pounds. It's about this big, this tall, draws more current than I want to give it. And when you switch from transmit to receive, you're physically like turning off the receiver, turning the transmitter on. If you're fancy, you got a relay that does it for you, but they are two separate functions. And that equipment is still out there, but any modern thing, you just have to realize it's combining those two separate functions. An RF power amplifier is a device that increases the transmitted output power from a transceiver. That's on the test, so I wanted to point that out. If you get a little mobile rig, or even if you get a handheld radio and you need to talk greater distance, the first thing you can do is hopefully get a better antenna. But you can also hook it up to an RF power amplifier. Antennas don't increase power. Antennas don't increase power. RF power amplifiers increase power. Bigger antennas just direct that energy to the direction you want it to go. And that's always at the expense of something else. So a big beam antenna, which we'll cover later in the course, might throw a whole lot of energy in one direction at the expense of not sending it other directions. When an antenna has gain, we often rate antennas by how much gain they have. Again, they are not increasing power, they're just sending that power in one direction. Video covered this stuff pretty well. I want to touch on this. FM, frequency modulation, is the mode that these handhelds use, most mobile radios use. At VHF and UHF, pretty much all your communications are going to be FM. If you're listening to a broadcast radio, you know you got AM and FM. The FM setting on your broadcast radio, that refers not on the broadcast radio, it covers both frequency and the type of modulation, but FM really just means the type of signal you're putting out, because you have to have a way to put information on a signal, and that's called modulation, which we'll get into later in the book. So I'm going to gloss over that, but on HF or shortwave, quite often you're using single sideband, SSB, sometimes AM, generally not FM, because except for a little slice of 10 meters, HF doesn't allow FM transmissions.
So the single sideband, we picked up a SDR player on this to listen.
Uh-huh.
What is single sideband?
Okay, good question. With amplitude modulation, you have to understand AM first, because SSB is a form of AM modulation. Okay. With AM modulation, as you speak, your voice makes that signal bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller in tune with your speech patterns. With FM, your voice is making the signal slightly higher and slightly lower in frequency. It's changing that frequency just a little bit, not anywhere near that extreme, just a little bit. But those little frequency variations are picked up in the receiver. With AM, it's the amplitude. Well, the problem with that is a lot of things have amplitude, like a lightning strike. When a lightning strike, there's a big surge of radio energy, and that comes across as a pop on the radio. When my furnace in my garage runs the igniter, that little igniter is making a little spark. That's creating amplitude modulation. So AM is noisier than FM. In a nutshell, that's the difference. But with AM, if you actually looked at what that signal looks like on a scope, you've got a big carrier, and the carrier doesn't have information itself, it's just a signal. As you speak, you're creating these sidebands on each side of the carrier, and they're what's actually changing in amplitude. Well, that carrier wastes a lot of energy, and the energy is duplicated in both of the sidebands. So if you filter out the carrier and filter out one of the sidebands, you're left with a single sideband that still has the modulation information. It still has your voice. And then in the receiver, you have to reconstruct the carrier to demodulate it. But because of that process, the signal takes up much less space in the radio spectrum.
Now, so you might talk about the other advantage just being more powerful since you've got a single sideband you can direct, but it affects more power off and get further distance than a single sideband.
That's a good point. The RF energy your radio is putting out is more concentrated with single sideband. Now, because the receiver has to reconstruct the carrier, you have to tune it in just right. And if you're off a little bit, you sound like Donald Duck or Tweety Bird or something. We're going to cover that in much greater detail next week. All right, you know the controls. I will cover squelch very briefly. If you turn this radio on right now, you won't just hear noise, it's just silent. That's because there's a circuit inside that until the signal level reaches a threshold that you set, it mutes the speaker. That's called squelch.
It's like a floor, actually.
There you go. Why do HTs have rubber ducks? Because they're durable and they're cheap. That great big long antenna that I pulled out is very fragile too. And you got to be careful because you can also break the connector on your radio using a big antenna like that. But one of the best things you can do though if you buy a handheld radio is to buy a better antenna. You don't have to get a great big long telescoping. One of these right here, that's probably about actual length, maybe a little shorter. They do a good job. And they're a good upgrade for the stock antenna that comes with the radio. For your car, you can drop a magnet mount antenna on the roof. You know, I used a mag mount antenna for 10 or 15 years. They work. But even better is if you want to drill a hole in your car. It is better. Honestly, I used a mag mount for years so I don't do damage to my car, but I realized I was rusting a big hole in my roof. I would have been better off just drilling a hole to begin with. It's not that big a deal. Now on modern cars, you got to be kind of careful how you hook radios up. I won't go into details, but that's very vehicle specific. You don't always just want to start drilling holes. You got to be careful of airbags. You've also got to be careful of how you get power to the radio in modern cars. But the newest car I own is from 1999, so I'm good. I'm putting a radio in a 1977 Chevy Blazer right now because that's my backup vehicle. But I want to talk about simplex communications versus repeater communications. This is really important to understand. This is important stuff. If you grab two radios, and let's say my wife and I are traveling in separate cars going on vacation. These are not ham radios, these are FRS radios. You got it? Shared with GMRS, they're the same basically now. GMRS just allows you to use better quality radios, bigger antennas, and a little more power. So I can hand her one of these. She's not a ham, it's no big deal. And with these FRS radios, they are simplex only. So that means when I'm talking, I'm sending out a signal, her radio is receiving it. I get done talking, I go back to receive mode, she can pick up the radio, she can start talking on the same frequency, and I'm receiving it. You're taking up one frequency, one person talks at a time, and it's just direct radio to radio. But as the video mentioned, you're limited, especially at VHF and UHF, you're limited by the radio horizon. These almost have to be line of sight. And there's a certain point where the curvature of the earth just gets in the way. Now, if you're on a mountaintop talking to someone else on a mountaintop, no problem, within reason. 20, 30 miles, not a big deal. If you can see the other radio, but if you're driving on flat ground, after 3 or 4 miles, curvature of the earth is such that you can't see the other end.
Yeah, so we've been running into that with our mesh task experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
I think we had, what, like 19 kilometers out of the one day?
Roughly, yeah, that's about 12 miles.
So,
Mm-hmm.
but that was from like the top of an overlook way out. You know,
Sure.
where it's basically beyond the line of sight because it's such low power.
Mhm.
Um,
The solution to that is a repeater. What if you had someone in the middle, someone that, let's say I'm in a car over here, my wife's in a car 10 miles away, and we've got someone in the middle with two radios. And let's say that these are on one frequency and then they're on a different frequency. If I hold the talk button on one while this one's receiving, the signal that I'm getting here is being retransmitted here to that receiver, to that person. That's a repeater. Now, if you wire these two radios together so that whenever you're receiving a signal on one, it automatically turns the transmitter on the other, that's what a repeater is. And quite literally, we have hooked up two mobile radios at a tower site, one receiving, one transmitting, and we've got a repeater on the air. That's what it is. But because you can put the repeater at a tall spot where all of your hams or GMRS users, because you can use repeaters on GMRS, where they can all see that tower, then everyone can communicate. But you're doing it, you have one talk frequency and one listen frequency. You're doing it on two frequencies because the repeater is simultaneously transmitting what it's hearing. Now with a mesh system, this isn't on the test, but usually what that does is that's like a store and forward.
yes.
So it receives a signal, and then when it's done receiving it, it transmits it again on the same frequency. That's not really done on ham radio very much.
Well, that wouldn't be very efficient with voice anyway.
Right.
Yeah, we've got a repeater at work, and so we've got handrail radios, and then we've got a base station that we work with.
Cool.
And like, I looked at the FCC filing for it,
Mhm.
so I got the frequency for it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, is any effect with the talk around? No, okay, so in case our repeater goes down, we got a backup,
Good.
and then it kicks it back to simplex.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
So,
The one thing that I'm not sure where it's covered in the slides, but I do wanted to point out, it is a question on the test, is what's the offset? What's the difference in frequency between the transmit and receive? In the commercial world, it's not standardized. In ham radio, it is. 5 megahertz for UHF, 600 kilohertz for 2 meter VHF. I shouldn't, go ahead and write that down. I shouldn't say UHF because there's several bands within UHF. The specific band we're talking about is called 70 centimeter, or 440, as it's often called. So the offset on 440, 70 centimeters, 5 megahertz. 5 megahertz up. So you transmit 5 megahertz higher than what your receiver is set at.
is the kilohertz the same up usually?
No, it's not.
Okay.
That's a little different. With 2 meter VHF, 144 to 148 megahertz, it's 600 kilohertz. If the receive frequency on your radio or the repeater transmit frequency is 147 megahertz, you transmit up 600 kilohertz. If it's 146 or 145, you transmit down 600 kilohertz.
Also, I'm not sure it's in here, but you can get an app to your phone called Repeater Book,
Okay.
which is a free app, and you can find geographic repeaters, and it'll give you that up or down indication as well as the listening frequency of the repeaters. So it's a great app to have, especially if you travel.
They've got a website too, right?
Yeah.
Repeaterbook.com.
Yeah, I've looked at their website.
Yeah, just get the app to your phone, especially if it's portable radio, you can be somewhere.
Right.
You want to know what the repeater frequency is, and then when you cut it down, you know, set.
And it uses the GPS of your phone to tell you what's closest to you.
Okay.
So it'll tell you the distance that you are physically from the repeater.
Oh, very cool.
My phone has it right in there. So here's the transmit. Here's transmit 145. And here's also 144.
Yep.
So it's the negative 60. Yeah, again, all the frequencies are what will show up there.
Yeah, very cool.
I'll also mention, you can receive, you can listen all you want.
That's the OPSDR. Is that
Mhm.
up?
Q signals. I'm going to say that within ham radio, I should say within public service communications, we strongly advise against using codes. 10 codes, for instance, because not everyone knows what those codes mean. Not everyone's on the same page. There are a few exceptions, and one of the exceptions is what's called Q signals. In ham radio, this kind of started with Morse code because these were a lot easier to send.
The whole sentence.
Right. And the two that are highlighted you have to know for the test. So let's say I'll take QSL for instance. I'll say, yeah, Larry, this is Nelson. I'm going to stop at Wendy's before we meet for the class. QSL, meaning, do you understand? And he'll say, QSL, means he understands. Or if we're talking on the repeater going down the road and I start to lose the repeater, I'll say, hey, Larry, let's QSY to the 147.28 repeater. QSY means change frequency. And he'll say, roger that, QSY to 147.28. And then he'll give his call sign and sign off. QSO or QSO is a common one. And sometimes you'll hear a ham say, hey, let's have an eyeball QSO. That means see you in person. Just a fun one I want to throw out there. QRM and QRN are important. They both mean interference. The way I remember them, what the difference is M means man-made and N means natural. I don't know if that's actually what it means, but that's how I remember it. So earlier tonight, Larry and I and Michael were talking on the radio. And at one point, Michael and I started talking at the same time. We created QRM because we is man-made interference. We interfered with each other. But then, I think it was Larry, someone also mentioned, hey, when you're transmitting, I can hear a funny tone on your transmissions. That might be QRN, natural-made noise. I didn't do anything wrong to make the noise, but something has gone wrong. Whether it's atmospheric or with my radio, I'm not sure, but so that's the difference. And those are important to know. We talked about Radio Horizon. Multipath propagation isn't really a thing that he really experienced on VHF, UHF very much. You do on shortwave HF, especially if you're picking up a station from a long ways away. I used to really enjoy listening to a station called Radio Australia on shortwave. Unfortunately, they're off the air, but they actually played some really cool music. I listened to their Saturday Night Country, which was Saturday morning here. But because the signal was coming from so far away, and it was finding so many different paths, it was bouncing off different parts of the ionosphere and being reflected in different ways. By the time that signal got back to me, it sounded like garbage because of multipath propagation. That signal wasn't bouncing just one bounce here, down to here, up to here, back to me. Always different paths that signal was coming to my receiver. And that can kind of come and go too and cause some really funky noise. So I'd say it's more of an HF thing myself. Picket fencing. Once you hear it, you'll understand exactly why it's called picket fencing. But as you're driving down the road, this is a mobile phenomenon, by the way. As you're driving down the road and you're listening to someone talking, as your car is moving along, that signal is being obstructed and reflected by different things very rapidly. And it almost sounds like if you see light shining through a picket fence while you're going down the road, where it's a very rapid fluttering, you can hear it, then you don't, then you hear it, then you don't, very rapid thing. I think that's on the test, that's why I wanted to bring that up. So someone might say, hey, how's my signal? And you might respond, you're full quieting into the repeater, except I'm getting some picket fencing. Obstructions, use the repeater or move around the obstruction. Polarization literally means what direction is the signal coming off from your antenna. With VHF and UHF, on FM, by standard, we almost always use vertical. That literally means you're holding the radio vertically, that signal is vertically polarized. If you were holding it sideways, now you're horizontally polarized. It's that simple. On HF, it's sometimes more common to use horizontal. Often we'll use dipole antennas that just happen to be strung horizontally. We'll get more into that. But the important thing to remember is that the polarization of the receiver really needs to match the polarization of the transmitter. This is a question on the test, so we'll talk about with FM, this is specific to FM, deviation, because I mentioned the frequency wiggles a little bit as you're speaking. The amount that it wiggles or deviates is your deviation. And there is a limit to how much you can deviate, because the greater your deviation, the more radio spectrum you're taking up, and pretty soon you're bumping into somebody else's signal. And so deviation needs to be kept to a minimum. Not to a minimum, but within spec. And I like the test, if you're over deviating, talk further away. Literally, yeah. Ideally, you'd adjust your transmitter, but literally the louder you talk, or the quieter you talk, or the further away your voice is, change that deviation. With AM, the greater the amplitude of your signal is proportional to how loud you're talking. So there's also a maximum amplitude. With your receiver can only modulate to a certain amount. Beyond that, you get clipping, you get distortion. It just doesn't sound good. It's a better way to put it. This is also on the test. If your audio doesn't sound good, you might be slightly off frequency, or your batteries might be going low. The battery going low thing is actually, it happens a lot. Or you'll start talking. Sometimes I'll be hearing someone, they'll be talking away, and then they just drop out. Well, then they start talking again. The next transmission, they'll talk and drop out because their battery just can't keep up for that period of time. It happens. And that is chapter 1. Oop, I went back. Anyways, does that make sense?